we're going to have a little adult conversation about blood. Now, the way you can kind of talk about blood and its function, you know, sometimes, like I put all hemoglobin stuff into the respiratory system, basically. So we're going to do a very brief overview of the plasma, role of hemoglobin, red blood cells, and we're mainly going to focus here on clotting, immunity, and little tiny bit on lymphatics. For the reference, anatomy exam on lymphatic system will be together with anatomy exam on the respiratory, because they're both laughable. Seriously, I'm talking like 10 questions for each max. So I combine them, otherwise it's ridiculously small. Okay? So this chapter, the only exam that you're going to have after it is going to be physiology exam. Anatomy will be merged with respiratory. Am I clear? Good? So, blood. If you will spin it down, you can separate it to 3 major layers. Plasma, red blood cells, and a buffy coat, which consists of white blood cells and platelets, leukocytes and platelets, which gives you a perception, a number. Red blood cells arguably are, not arguably, are the most abundant human cells, period. You have most of them. You can see the cells on the typical blood smear here. Red blood cells, monocytes, different types of white blood cells here. White blood cells are bigger, they have nucleus. Red blood cells, no nucleus. Cellular components of the cell, of the blood, platelets, red blood cells, and white blood cells, are called formed elements. Does that make sense? So the functions, you already probably know that the function of red blood cells is the oxygen transport. Function of white blood cells, different types of immune responses. And platelets responsible for the formation of a clot. What about plasma? What does it consist of? Mostly water. Yeah. A bunch of electrolytes. Basically, the electrolyte content of plasma is very, very similar to electrolyte content of extracellular fluid. The main difference between the plasma and extracellular fluid, the amount of proteins. Plasma is more rich in proteins. The main component is albumin, produced by liver. It's a main regulator of osmotic pressure. Okay. Alpha and beta globulins are responsible for transport. We talked about transport of fats in the blood before, fats that are not water soluble. Alpha and beta globulins will do just that. They will transport chemicals that are fat soluble, cannot be transported otherwise in the blood. And then we have gamma globulins, which are essentially antibodies. Fibrinogen is another protein that is extremely abundant in the blood. It is responsible for coagulation responses. Clot formation and coagulation responses together, they give you a response that is called hemostasis. We'll talk about it. Fibrinogen essentially, bless you, fibrinogen essentially forms fibers, threads that reinforce clot, preventing additional blood loss. Does that make sense? What else are you going to find there? Various products of like protein metabolism. Urea, uric acid, metabolic products like creatinine, so on and so forth. Gases, and nutrients, of course. Okay? But in this conversation, we're going to focus on the cells, And we're going to focus on the clotting response. The red blood cells, how they transport oxygen, we're going to talk about it in the chapter on the respiratory system. So, red blood cells, they look like donuts with, when you forget to remove the donut hole. Okay? It's called biconcave shape. Biconcave. They're small, 7 to 8 micrometers in diameter. They generated in the bone marrow, and they live a pretty long and decent life, 3 to 4 months, until they are destroyed in the spleen or liver, mainly in the spleen. They carry hemoglobin, the protein, hemoglobin. Hemoglobin, shown here, consists of 4 individual protein subunits, 2 beta subunits and 2 alpha subunits. Each subunit of hemoglobin is bound to a molecule of heme. In the olden times, some crazy biochemistry professors or physiology professors would require students to know the exact chemical structure of heme. My only question always was why? What's the learning, except for the nightmares, what's the learning experience associated? Okay. Heme is the molecule that binds in its center, binds iron. And iron, in turn, can carry oxygen around. So basically, the only function of red blood cells that contain an enormous amount of hemoglobin is to carry oxygen that's bound to hemoglobin molecules. So if one iron can bind one molecule of oxygen, and each molecule of hemoglobin contains 4 irons, how many oxygens can be carried? 4. Not necessarily all 4 will be there, but from none to 4. Does that make sense? Hemoglobin that does not carry any oxygen is called deoxyhemoglobin. Basically, this is what you're going to find in red blood cells before they reach lungs. When they get in the lungs, they bind oxygen and become oxyhemoglobin, which then, through the left atrium and left ventricle, enters the systemic circulation and delivers oxygen to the tissues, where it unloads oxygen and becomes deoxyhemoglobin again. Now, a few important things. First of all, no nucleus. They are one of 2 major types of anucleated cells. Red blood cells and platelets have no nucleus whatsoever. They also have no mitochondria. They don't have any oxidative respiration. Why? To save oxygen that they carry. Honestly, they don't do much. They just shuffle oxygen from point A to point B. Now, what can stimulate? This shows you all the steps of differentiation. You have hematopoietic stem cell, which goes through multiple steps. Okay? And, all those steps, I'm not asking, come on. What is the learning experience about it? Eventually, it becomes red blood cell. Now, what can trigger production of red blood cells? Blood loss. Blood loss, you have less oxygen delivered to tissues because you basically have less red blood cells. You will start producing more red blood cells. What else? Anemia, yes. It depends on what kind of anemia you have. Does that make sense? Because if you have a plastic anemia, that's an inability of bone marrow to produce red blood cells. It's kind of, it would like to produce, but it cannot. What else? Anyone went to the mountains, like 10,000 feet above the sea level? Did you go? No? Anyone? Utah, Colorado, California? Ohio? Appalachian is not enough. You need somewhere high. If you go there, it's terrible. Walking is okay. Running is absolutely horrific experience. Okay? I tried it once at 8,000 feet running. I'm a pretty good runner. I'm not bragging. I can run for a long time. After 2 miles, I wanted to shoot myself. It's awful. It's absolutely awful. You feel suffocated. And I was there for 5 days. And then I came back to Louisiana. I was flying. I was like Usain Bolt. Because even that short experience in hypoxic environment, hypoxia, didn't have enough oxygen in the first place. Okay? Even that short experience increased my red blood cell numbers so that for a week or two after I came back, my aerobic endurance was incredible. I was running. I probably would set my personal record in any long distance run. Okay? This is one of the... So, oxygen, any type of oxygen availability. Okay? Amount of hemoglobin in the cell, of course, will also increase their numbers. It's kind of a compensation response. Hemoglobin is produced at the less level, so MCH parameter. Okay? Number of cells will go up. And iron deficiency anemia. Okay. Now, aplastic anemia, the attempt is there, but they're not going to be produced efficiently, or they're not going to be functional. The common pathology, so if bone marrow or differentiation of red blood cells doesn't work that well, often what is observed in the blood smear, instead of functional red blood cells, okay, can be seen are reticulocytes, immature erythrocytes. Usually presence of reticulocytes signals that there is some kind of a problem with bone marrow, maybe cancer or something else. Does that make sense? Now we're gonna stop, of course.